up my share screen right now?
You can do it after I introduce you or now, whichever you prefer.
If I do it now, it's less hassle later, isn't it?
Possibly.
Well, let me see how to do that. I don't know how to do that. Hang on. Share. Okay, I'm going to share. Oh, no, hang on. I haven't got the flash drive in. Oi, oi, oi.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Wallace, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. Let me just find my introduction here for Dr. Bartrop. Although I know him well enough by now, it should be. Tonight is my honor and privilege to introduce my mentor, my dear friend, Dr. Paul Bartrop. Dr. Bartrop is an award-winning, a multi-award-winning scholar of Holocaust and Genocide. He's a professor emeritus of history and former director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Research at Florida Gulf Coast University, right here in Fort Myers, Florida. He is now an honorary principal fellow of history at the University of Melbourne, Australia. And he's the author of 25 books, the most recent of which are The Holocaust in Australia, Refugees, Rejection, and Memory, forthcoming in August of 2022, so coming out very shortly here. He's also written recently the Routledge History of Second World War in 2021, Children of the Holocaust, 2020, Heroines of Vichy France, Rescuing French Jews During the Holocaust, 2019, Perpetrating the Holocaust, Leaders, Enablers, and Collaborators from 2019, The Holocaust, a resource and document collection, which is 4 volumes published in 2017, which also won the Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award for 2018. Dr. Bartrop is a past president of the Australian Association of Jewish Studies and was vice president of the Midwestern Jewish Studies Association here in the United States. And in his free time, he lectures literally across the globe. So as you listen to Dr. Bartrop's speech tonight, his talk tonight, if you have any questions or comments for him, go ahead and post those in the YouTube comment or chat box for us, and I'll make sure to moderate those over to you. But for now, without further ado, I present to you Dr. Paul Bartrop. He's just getting himself set up here.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I don't know how I'll go with this this setup of which you speak. Trying to bring these slides to fruition here. Excuse me, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be able to come back again. And I believe I'm concluding your Holocaust week. Now, if I can organize here the screen share. Not so easy because things don't want to play with me at the present time very well.
We can see your screen, Dr. Bartrop. If you want to put it into presentation mode, you'll be all set.
Yeah, I'd like to do that, except the controls at the top are getting in the way.
Oh.
And I don't know that I'll be able to do that.
You can access the control for putting it into presentation mode at the bottom right next to the little zoom bar, so you can magnify or scroll out. So in PowerPoint, if you look over where your clock is,
yes,
you'll see above that, there's a bar with a little bit of icons and a zoom, and it's the one right next to the negative symbol. Yeah, right there. Right. And that'll throw you into presentation mode on the current slide.
Slideshow, I've got it there saying slideshow. Very good. I pressed and nothing happened at the present time. It's a good start, isn't it? Might be the computer bit's being a bit slow. Let me start anyway. As you can see from there, the first slide is really the one that says what this presentation is about. What I'd like to be doing in the presentation is examining 3 ways in which children during the Holocaust confronted their situation and found some measure of autonomy. At the outset, several weeks ago, Sarah mentioned to me that the general theme that they wanted to pursue at FSW this time round was freedom. So I thought, well, this is a possible way of dealing with that. How children went about finding some measure of autonomy under the Nazis. The three strategies I'd like to talk to at the present time are passing in wider society. We'll talk about that. Smuggling and selling on the black market. I'm going to stop the share here, I think, make life a little easier all round. How's that going there, Steve? Are we back to me?
We are, just you.
Just me. I'm sorry, everybody. Not sorry that's me, but sorry about the slides not working. So passing in wider society, smuggling and selling on the black market. In each of these, generalized of necessity, of course, I'll be considering how the strategies the children adopted contributed to their ultimate survival. I'll start with talking about passing. The act of passing takes place when a person chooses to alter his or her identity by submerging into a group with a different identity to their own. This means separating from their original family. Sometimes during the Holocaust, of course, they had no option. There was no family left. Or separating from their community, certainly separating from their lifestyle. During the Holocaust, passing as non-Jewish meant nothing less than self-preservation. Jews who adopted the strategy of passing were forced into several transformations. This usually involved a name change, but could also include their accent, if possible, their manner of dress, if possible, word choices, if they knew they were able to make them, and other aspects to blend in unnoticed with the non-Jewish majority around them. The Jew who passed was always aware that his or her condition was only temporary. At least that was their hope. And trying to pass as a non-Jew was far from easy. Local customs had to be understood instinctively. And an equally instinctive appreciation of the shades and subtleties of regional jargon had to be obvious, presuming the person could speak the language in the first place. Clearly, knowing something of local culture was also vital, as well as knowing the varied forms of social interaction, such as eating and drinking habits, cultural norms, and religious customs. Clearly, a Jewish person, a Jewish child, would not be able to pursue Jewish religious practice, but there would be an expectation in certain circles of knowing how to genuflect, how to do the mass, what various Christian prayers would be, and so forth. There are often so many ways in which a Jew could be exposed that people were always looking over their shoulder for fear of being recognized. Now, that's for all people. Passing presented many more problems for children than for adults. If questioned, they needed to be able to explain why they were alone. Start with that. Such a moment could give them away immediately. Moreover, how to respond was something for which children in wartime Europe were frequently not prepared, owing to their age and the prevailing seen but not heard culture which applied to children. And all too often, they might not have parents from whom they could learn how to behave appropriately. Further, children without parents were much less likely to possess, let's say, forged identity cards. And that too could lead to immediate exposure or any form of identification in accordance with their new and different identity. Documents, moreover, had to be made out in a name that was not identifiably Jewish. Therefore, questions arose for children as to whose name should be on the documents. They needed help along the way. A new identity would then have to be learned, What is your name? Well, my name is, and the minute they give away their real name, they're gone. Those new names would have to be learned from scratch. Child would have to memorize every aspect of their new identity and then know how to stick to the story. And clearly, of course, the younger they were, the greater the danger. Not only this, but if they were to pass in non-Jewish society, they had not only to possess money, but also know how to use it, aspects of daily life for which they were often not prepared. So clearly, help from friendly non-Jews was indispensable. Though, of course, if you think about it, children placing themselves in the hands of others was an obvious vulnerability that could see them undone. Risk, risk, risk. Such everyday issues as clothing could also give away children who were passing. If they came from outlying areas, if they had escaped from a ghetto in a non-Jewish area of a city, the clothing they wore, which might be shabby perhaps, given, I don't know, impoverishment or just general wear and tear, could signal that they were not local. And Jewish boys were additionally vulnerable due to their circumcision, which was not a usual practice for non-Jews in Eastern Europe. Passing might sometimes have been easier in Western Europe rather than further east. Again, I'm generalizing when I say that. But in all societies, the problems were always more difficult for children than for adults. And the problems for adults, let's face it, were difficult enough. Passing in non-Jewish society was never a soft option. It was always going to be challenging for children to forge new identities in another location where they were previously unknown. Often this would render them defenseless. As I said, never a soft option. So we move from there. From passing, we move to smuggling as a strategy, as a sort of survival strategy. What do we mean we talk about smuggling? Relates to, if you like, the illegal, this is what will be a definitional sort of thing that I would give in my classes, the illegal transportation of items, which could be articles, animals, or people, from one place to another in violation of authority. During the Holocaust, smuggling took place in several ways, especially through the movement of Jewish refugees to places of safety, what we today would refer to as people smuggling. We'd also consider the illegal transfer, another form of smuggling, the illegal transfer of food or weapons or other commodities from one place into or towards Jewish communities. But we could say that most smuggling on a day-to-day basis was small scale. Within the ghettos, where German administrations deliberately limited food supplies to an absolute minimum, hunger was present. Hunger was present from the very beginning. Hunger intensified over time. Smuggling food from what was referred to as the Aryan side, the non-Jewish side of the ghetto wall, which was usually done mainly by children. Smuggling food was often the only option of providing the ghetto with additional supplies, the additional supplies needed for people to keep alive, to hold body and soul together in a situation that was not intended to hold body and soul together. Medicine was another commodity from outside coming back into the ghetto. At its peak, in April 1941, take one example. At its peak in April 1941, the population of the Warsaw Ghetto was well over 400,000 people, crammed into a tiny walled-in fraction of the city. Of that 400,000, at least 85,000 were children aged under 14 and under. Smuggling by children never ceased and took place anywhere an opportunity presented itself. Through gaps in the ghetto walls, through the blind spots in or near the gates, via underground tunnels, through sewers, and through houses and other buildings bordering onto the walls. It's often not realized that sometimes the occupying Nazis, the occupying Germans, utilized buildings, existing buildings, to form part of the ghetto wall. Find your way through the buildings surreptitiously somehow, and you found a way out. Children. I think of my own grandchildren in this regard. Children scaled walls. Children scaled walls to smuggle food into the ghettos, despite the Germans doing all in their power to seal off the ghetto. What would they do to seal off the ghetto? Well, apart from it obviously being guarded, they, of course, a wall is a form of fence that would fit barbed wire along the top of the wall, fit broken glass along the top of the walls, as well as, of course, you'd say building the walls to insurmountable heights. Despite this, smuggling by children still took place. Their small size and dexterity enabled them to pass through breaches in the ghetto walls, often unnoticed, as adults would be. Others could act as lookouts, a little team effort here, acting as lookouts while other little kids would run through whatever apertures they could find. Those designated to do the smuggling were sometimes very young children indeed, aged as young as 5 and 6 years old, as on record. Perhaps if there's a form of measurement around this, averaging things out, most were probably between 10 and 14, so far as we can tell. Crawling through narrow openings in the walls, these youngsters were a vital resource for their families, as long as their families remained alive. And it shouldn't be forgotten that the ghetto was also a place with rampant disease. People relied increasingly on smuggled food to stay alive. The children, of course, not only had to find their way through the wall, but then when they're on the other side, also had to locate and obtain the goods they were seeking. It was hazardous getting out. It was hazardous operating once on the other side. And it was hazardous then getting back in again. But of course, they risked their very lives in this endeavour. If they were caught smuggling anything, no matter how paltry, the penalty very frequently was death. Among the measures instituted by Ludwig Fischer, the Nazi governor of the Warsaw district from 1941, was a proclamation. He made a proclamation imposing a mandatory death penalty on any Jews who left the ghetto. This sealed the fate of all smugglers, children and adults alike. And yes, following the orders they received, German soldiers, or SS, shot child smugglers in great numbers. And even if they were for some reason not killed, the children were at the very least severely punished. Now, the word lucky in this context is obnoxious. But if they were I'll use the air quotes, lucky, they might escape with a beating from a ghetto policeman, kicked in the butt and then sent on their way. Although they faced such grave danger every day, they didn't stop. As I said, very frequently this was a team effort. Various groups might devise a system of, let's say, smuggling bags of turnips or potatoes through a hole in the ghetto wall, while others engaged outside doing forced labour might grab the potatoes or vegetables or sometimes perhaps bread to bring back in. They might hide these few items in their sleeves or under their shirt. All too often they found themselves to be identified. All too frequently, sadly, these little small-scale smuggling activities would be discovered, and the goods had to be surrendered upon arriving back in the ghetto after these hazards that they'd gone through, after which the children would await their fate. Now, I want to build on that stuff here, if you'll indulge me for a moment. I want to introduce you to Henryka Lezavetovna. Henryka Lezavetovna was a Jewish poet, generally considered to be one of the most eminent to come out of interwar and wartime Poland. In 1941, she wrote her best-known poem. It was called The Little Smuggler. It tells the story of what you're about to hear says it all much, much better than I could. The poem, I'm going to relate the poem to you. It tells the story of a small child who supports his starving family by bringing over food supplies from the Aryan side into the ghetto. The text of the poem, in Polish, Hebrew, and English, is today inscribed on the monument to the memory of child victims of the Holocaust, located on Okopowa Street in Warsaw. The poem was first published in 1947. And if you'll indulge me, here is the poem. Over the walls, through holes, through the guard posts, through the wire, through the rubble, through the fence, hungry, cheeky, stubborn, I slip through, I nip through like a cat. At midday, in the night, at dawn, in snowstorms, foul weather and heat, 100 times I risk my life. I stick out my childish neck. A rough sack under my arm, wearing torn rags on my back, with nimble young legs, and in my heart constant fear. But you have to bear it all, and you have to put up with it all, so that tomorrow you will have your fill of bread. Over the walls, through holes, through bricks, at night, at dawn, and in day, cheeky, hungry, crafty, I move as quietly as a shadow. And if the hand of fate unexpectedly catches up with me one day in this game, it is an ordinary trap of life. Mother, don't wait for me anymore. I will not be coming back to you again. The voice will not be heard from afar. The dust of the streets will bury the fate of the lost child. And I have only one request, and the grimace is set on the lips. Who, mother, will bring you your bread tomorrow? Henryka Lezavetovna was murdered at Treblinka in August 1942, aged just 33. Before her deportation, friends offered to find a safe house in which she and her mother could live. She refused to accept this, however, arguing that she was needed by the orphaned and homeless children for whom she was caring at the time. Well, we'll move from that horrible story to looking at selling. I said there were, at the outset, I said there were three strategies I wanted to discuss with you: passing, smuggling, and selling. And as a focus for examining how children survive through selling things, selling items, I'd like to provide one example, a story of what are known as the cigarette sellers of 3 Crosses Square in Warsaw. This relates to a band of Jewish children, generally aged anywhere between 7 and 16, thereabouts. They eked out a precarious existence, selling cigarettes, newspapers, anything else worth hawking to Poles and Germans, while hiding the fact that they were Jewish. How did they get the items? Often by smuggling towards them. And they were passing. We've got the confluence here. 3 Crosses Square was in the heart of a Warsaw district taken over by the Germans. A nearby youth welfare building had become a barracks for SS troops. Another building nearby was the location of a German police station. A third, close by, housed an Allied Hungarian force that was barracked there. Not far away, the Gestapo maintained an office. We're talking about really the belly of the beast in this area. A fellow called Joseph Zimian, who was a commander of the underground Jewish fighting organization, was a Jew passing as a non-Jew on the Aryan side of the wall in this area. He had a watching brief for street children who escaped from the ghetto. One day he encountered 2 of them by accident at a soup kitchen. This encounter was to lead him into a world in which several Jewish children were surviving together by begging and selling items such as cigarettes to Poles and Germans. After the ghetto had been established in 1940, some of the older children managed to sneak out of the ghetto to obtain additional food for their hungry families. They would beg on the Aryan side, after which they would smuggle back to the ghetto whatever they had managed to obtain. Over a period of time, they remained on the Aryan side of the wall. Most had become by now orphans. All hid their Jewish identities and slept on the streets. Sometimes they would sleep in cemeteries. Very rarely they would beg a night here and there from a friendly Jewish family, friendly Polish family, beg your pardon. The background to the story of the cigarette sellers was to be found in the story of one of the boys, Irving or Ignaz Milchberg. Born in 1927. So what are we talking about? By the time we get to 1940, he's maybe 13. He was known to everybody by the nickname of Bull. Within the ghetto, Bull and his family had managed to make ends meet until the Germans began their roundup of Jews for the first deportation to Treblinka in the summer of 1942. This very enterprising young man, Bull, escaped custody 3 times. He managed to obtain a false work permit. How did he do that? He connected up with some forced labourers working at nearby rail yards began smuggling food and smooth food and goods into and out of the ghetto with their assistance. One day, outside on the other side of the wall, Bull noticed a group, he identified a group of 4 Jewish children. They adopted him. They found themselves under his care, and with the railway workers helping as well, helping this little surrogate family of children, until the railway workers themselves were tragically deported. For a year and a half, Bull and the other children lived a hand-to-mouth existence under conditions of extraordinary stress and fear of exposure, fear of arrest, fear looking at what was happening inside the ghetto of possible deportation. Among Bull's friends were other street children. Among his little group, they weren't a gang, his little group of kids who all worked together, try and help each other. They went by some amazing names, as kids do. Toothy, Hoppy, Conky, Baldy, Whitey, Carrot Top, Frenchie, and Chopper. Kids in the playground today have got similar names. I was known as Barty because of my last name, or I was known as Bear. I reckon Carrot Top must have been a redhead, though. Must have been a ginger. By 1942, during 1942, Joseph Zimian, the resistance leader, had befriended members of the group. Now, how many are we talking about this group? Well, it numbered anywhere between 14 and maybe 25. It was an amorphous group that came and went. There were at least 5 girls that he identified in this group. They weren't all just sort of street boys. Often the kids were the sole survivors of their families. And again, they adopted him as a sort of a protector. And having been welcomed into the group, he was able to provide them with false identity papers like his own. However, unfortunately, we've got to talk about a however. One of the boys, the one named Frenchie, disappeared one day after having been picked up and handed over to the Gestapo. Fearing that Frenchie might expose them, presuming he was still alive, they didn't know, the kids didn't know, fearing that if he still was alive, he would have been certain to have exposed them, the children scattered. Each went their own way until the liberation of Warsaw by the Soviet Army in January 1945. How they survived individually is again through this hand-to-mouth existence, plus also the assistance of friendly people on occasion, if they could identify them. By the end of the war, all but 3 of the original group were still alive. Most of the survivors later moved to Israel or the United States or Canada. And after the war, Joseph Zimian recorded the children's story. He wrote it up as a book which through Amazon or Abe Books or whoever can still be purchased. It was published in 1963 in Polish, then in English in 1970. You could probably pick it up from a Amazon seller. And it was called The Cigarette Sellers of Three Crosses Square. Since then, it's appeared in Polish, Romanian, Hebrew, and Yiddish, as well as English, like I said. Now, Joseph Zimian, who exposed all this story, who was adopted by the children, died in 1971, aged just 49. But Bull, Irving Milchberg, survived to a ripe old age of 86, died in Toronto in January 2014. One of the remarkable features of the whole story, as I can identify it, is that at the time he took the cigarette sellers under his wing, Zimian was only 5 years older than Bull. And yet Bull and the other kids considered him as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, to be an adult man. He was a commander of a little unit in the Jewish underground. Only 5 years difference between them. Okay, I've got one eye on the clock here. We might want to have a little discussion. I'm just going to conclude with a few reflections here. Gets back to what we were talking about at the start when I was invited to give this address on the general theme of freedom. Children who survived the Holocaust had lived through a dazzling array of experiences by the time of their freedom or their liberation. These experiences dated from before the war, becoming enmeshed then in the very killing machinery of the Third Reich during the war itself. Again, I must generalize here. As I would have said to my students at FGCU, we have to ask whether or not what I'm about to relate is representative of the broader experience. Sometimes that's all we've got, is the ability to generalize. There will always be exceptions. But what do we know about children during the Holocaust? Well, they were victimized, deprived of an education, bullied, beaten, hidden, passed from place to place, smuggled over borders, starved, imprisoned in concentration camps, separated from their murdered parents and often other family members, might be required to take care of smaller siblings. Certainly they witnessed atrocities until ultimately, hopefully, would be liberated, but liberated into a world for them devoid possibly of direction, devoid of a predictable future. Of the millions of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, the figure of 1.5 million children under the age of 18 is generally given as the best approximation of those who were lost. This translates, often overlooked, often missed, this translates into most European Jewish children alive in 1939 when the war began. Only an estimated 150,000 survived. 10%. The world into which they emerged bore little to no resemblance to the peaceful life they might have enjoyed before the war. And for many children, peaceful and happy life they might have enjoyed before the war. Given this, child survivors lost their early years. And in much of their subsequent life, they tried to catch up. Now, here in Melbourne, Australia, where I live, we have a most remarkable Jewish community. At least 50% of the Jewish community of Melbourne is comprised of what we refer to as Holocaust generations. Firstly, survivors, less of those now, their children, grandchildren, now we're into the great-grandchildren of a Holocaust background. And I might tell you, so very many of them we could probably refer to as overachievers. Why is this the case? They've been desperately trying to catch up with what was lost. But the immediate aftermath of the war was preoccupied with issues relating to coping with loss, mourning, learning how to establish a new life, finding partners who might have some understanding of how best to appreciate what they went through. And then, through all of that, making a home and starting a family. For many, meeting these challenges meant confronting their Holocaust experience. Equally, as Elie Wiesel has told us, for many, this could only be done through silence. Silence about the events that had such a devastating impact on their first years. Now, just for me to finish, ladies and gentlemen, as the last eyewitnesses, and we will say the last victims of the Holocaust, child survivors are keenly aware of the important role they can play as what we might refer to as memory keepers. Their voices, in recent years, in so many ways, their voices have been, I would emphasize, they need to be heard. They are the last remnants of those who experienced the Holocaust in their very flesh. And while today I've shown just a few ways in which some children managed to find ways to survive, I think it should be borne in mind always that most children were unable to do so and were murdered. We can't find a happy ending. The Holocaust, despite what we see in films, despite what we see in popular culture, in the vast majority of instances, the Holocaust wasn't a place for happy endings. Where children are concerned, what are we talking about? We're talking about the most innocent of all victims during the Holocaust. More work is yet to be done. I've done a little bit of it. My challenge to you is, whoever's listening out there today, right now, all the way from Melbourne, Australia, to Fort Myers, Florida and beyond, New Jersey, wherever you might be, go search for those who were children, speak with them, encourage them to speak to you, encourage them to speak to those who are near and dear to you. Learn their stories, understand, try to understand. And I'll leave it on that note. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartrop. That's a very powerful, well-needed call to arms, if you will. We need these stories. I mean, we're starting to hear within our own program include the stories of the children of survivors. We're starting to have more of the second generation speak out. So we're encouraging and broadening out that net and saying we need to make sure that all of the survivors have left some form of record, even if it's not on a public scale like this. At least let their families know what happened, because I can't tell you how many children of survivors told me, well, I don't know the exact details of mom or dad's story, but here's what I think I know. We've got to get those exact facts out there one way or another. So
thank you.
Thank you so
I might
much
just build on that, Sarah, if I may. I don't want to turn it into another presentation, but I found that similar is true for veterans. I look back at my own dad, who was an Australian soldier fighting in the islands in the Pacific during the war, and I used to ask him, as kids do, "What did you do in the war, Daddy?" Yeah. And all he told me was that I shined the general's boots. Later on, I learned some of the horrible things that happened that he was witness to, and he was repressing this. He didn't want to get the story out. It was too hard for him, and that's part of the, as you call it, the call to arms. That's another part of the concern that we've got to try and overcome.
Absolutely, it's there. I mean, my mother's father was in the 101st Airborne. When he came back, he didn't tell any of his family, direct family, what happened, but he told my father because they worked together, and Dad was a history buff and he wanted to know. So Papa told him all the details. So you do have some questions here. Let me roll up. You've got lots of folks saying thank you and 3 cheers, very powerful. So let's see. I think you touched upon this a good bit, but just to clarify here, Sydney asks, could children get arrested or taken for smuggling things? You mentioned that they would get shot, that they could be beaten. Are there any instances of those children being deported or arrested that you've?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, and frequently. The stories that we have of children who worked on smuggling stuff and were caught are a legend in terms of those who didn't make it. They would be nabbed just for the purpose of, well, here's somebody else to help add to the list of those being deported right now. And the Nazis had no compunction about doing a thing like that. So the answer is absolutely they were. Not just arrested, but also deportation fodder straight away.
So it's a troublesome. Let's see, we've got another question here. What started typhus? What caused typhus? And were children commonly affected by this in the ghettos, in the Warsaw Ghetto, for example?
I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know, but I suppose in any situation where people are living crammed together in a tiny area, sort of living on top of each other, people weren't living according to how many people were living in an apartment, but how many people were living in a room.
Right.
A situation like that, I mean, look, we're just coming out of the pandemic now. People breathing on each other is sufficient, but we're in a situation where there is debility as well, through starvation, whatever it might be. A situation where there are where vermin is rife. Any number of diseases, I'm sure, would have been prevalent.
Yeah.
And vulnerabilities as a result, human vulnerabilities as a result, kicked in there. If I knew the science, I would develop the science further, but that's my understanding at any rate.
I understand. I think typhus is caused by bugs. So I'm wondering, as we're talking about this, I wonder if the children who were able to get out and smuggle things back and forth, since they were out a little bit more, I wonder if perhaps if we looked at the numbers, if there are numbers, if we would see that it reflects that perhaps they didn't catch diseases as commonly as those who stayed within the ghetto time in, time out, 24/7.
It's a really good consideration, and I'm sure, for example, that the kids who were the cigarette sellers, well, they managed to survive and hold body and soul together, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Rachel says, amazing presentation as always, Dr. Bartrop.
Thank you. Richard
Stein, a second generation, pointed out a lot of the tough folks have passed, unfortunately. So
of course. I might just add just a second thought, is about disease. These are the sorts of questions that are going to haunt me later, and I've got to get back to you and get back to you and get back to you. But of course, the availability of clean water is also an issue, and diseased water, and
dysentery.
You mentioned bugs. There was no clean water supply, such that there would be a water supply as such. Get what you could get from rainwater, and or not melting snow, but eating snow, whatever it might be. The ghetto was very far from a clean place, and a clean and a dirty environment is where you're going to find horrible things of the kind. I've dealt with that. Okay.
Yes. So since we're talking about children, there's a question here as well. What were common Nazi doctor experiments that were specifically utilizing children as fodder and as guinea pigs?
Oh, wow. That goes way beyond this presentation, but I can tell you, well, just in doing that, I'm going to do this show and tell right now. In 2020, my goodness, 2020 sounds like 100 years ago, doesn't it, for all of us? I did a book with my colleague. I'm going to hold this up here now for show and tell. Did a book with a colleague of mine, Eve Grimm, called Children of the Holocaust. You can see it there. I hope you can see it okay. There we are. American publisher. Go out, everybody should buy one. Every Jewish home should have one. All good booksellers. And in that, one of the things that we covered was medical experimentation. A lot of people will think automatically of Dr. Josef Mengele. He went out looking for children. Specifically, he when a transport arrived, there were orders out there for twins, particularly for children who were twins, particularly, and some of the most obnoxious, disgusting. I don't want to say to you what some of these experiments were right now, or you won't want to go and have your dinner. I could read them out from the book. I'm not going to do that. It's altogether too horrible. But the important thing I want to explain is that medical experimenter, not only on children, but there were certain people who, such as Dr. Mengele, who deliberately sought out children for the purpose of these bogus and most obnoxious medical experiments, just to see what would work. I'll give you one example that comes to mind. I don't want to go through an entire litany of them, but one experiment that comes to mind in taking twins, children, the younger the better, he would attempt to, oh my God, to sew them together, mixing their veins and sinews and things to see whether or not he could create Siamese twins. This is so bizarre that you'd say, well, this is the sort of thing that you see on, oh, I don't know, one of the zombie movies or something like that, that people would do crazy stuff. It was to no obvious medical purpose, other than to, what would we say, satisfy a curious, if unbelievably twisted and warped mind.
A monstrous curiosity, to be certain. As I said in my presentation yesterday, these people called everyone else subhuman, but in all of their actions, Nazis and Nazi doctors, they were the ones who were subhuman by all accounts. One question, what were the average ages of these children, especially of the smugglers and the sellers?
Well, I mentioned that so far as we can tell, and I'm sure that there's been lots of work done at Yad Vashem in Israel over this, and possibly somebody at the USHMM has looked into this in Washington, DC. We'd be talking anywhere between, well, the 5 or 6, less likely, but anywhere between 10 and 14. Okay. So the smugglers would actually be, the smaller they were, the greater is the likelihood they can wiggle into a little hole or something in the wall. But to have the wherewithal to be able to do what has to be done, you've got to be at least a little bit more together in your mind, and so a little bit older than the tiny kids.
So Rachel, I think that was one question, and then Rachel had another question, but I think you pretty well answered that there. Her question was, were children pretty much chosen because of their size and how small they were, their ability to scoot through small spaces and whatnot? Absolutely. Yeah,
but I don't think they were necessarily chosen. I mean, bigger kids might have said, hey, little brother, come over here and do that. But very often, out of utter desperation, kids would take these on their own bat and just go and do it.
They were just good at it.
The more so when they don't have their families anymore, they're on their own. Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yep.
Even little kids know that.
Yes, absolutely.
The commands of nourishment are absolute in a human being. Anyone who's a parent knows that a child will usually cry because they're in pain or they're hungry. It's as simple as that.
I always joke with my students and say that Snickers has an excellent ad campaign. You're not yourself when you're hungry, and you will do anything when you're hungry.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely true. Question that I have for you. Earlier, we were talking about deportation, I'm sorry, displaced person camps. And I wonder, I know that there were DP camps.
Excuse me, earlier in your programs.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah,
this morning.
Not us.
No, not us. Earlier in the program, yes. The curator, Cody Rodmaker, was discussing this from the Holocaust Museum down in Naples. And we were talking about DP camps. Were there resources that were offered to children who found themselves in the similar situation? I'm thinking about, the cigarette kids where they've disbanded and now they're kind of all by themselves. What would they do, especially if they were too young to say, well, I'm going to go out and make it on my own? What kind of resources, what kind of help would they get, and where would they go to rebuild their lives, living on the street, obviously?
Yeah, well, a perfect example of that is Elie Wiesel himself, who was, I think, 16 when he was liberated. Start off, he was in a DP camp, displaced persons camp, but with the forms of support. Look, these days, a person is in a combat situation or a terrible situation or in the aftermath of, I don't know, Hurricane Irma or whatever it might have been. People were talking about PTSD. People weren't talking about that. There was very little in the way of what would we call them, psychological assistance networks or anything like that. Elie Wiesel found himself with a group, or placed into a group that was organised by, and I can't remember offhand whether it was a Red Cross organisation or whether it was a Jewish organisation, to assist some form of reintegration. He found himself back in, sent off to Paris for purposes of reintegration. Kids weren't automatically just dumped into a camp and said, okay, fend for yourselves now in a DP camp situation. There were attempts to bring the children back into some form of life. But we would call it today extraordinarily rudimentary compared to what we would have today by things of that kind.
Thank you. Just popped into my mind of what do you do with this group of kids that are really street savvy now? Because I know that especially during this point in time, people were a little bit leery sometimes of adopting orphans, especially, in America, adopting a foreign orphan. And then when you hear that they were a smuggler, or they were living on the streets during this time, they would, oh my goodness, do I want to take on this task, especially if they were a teenager? So that the whole story is very, very fascinating. As you say, we really need to look at this more closely and think about this more closely as well. This is a very interesting subgroup of folks that lived through.
And I think often overlooked in the bigger picture. People talk about Jewish victims of the Holocaust without realizing that there were different approaches to being able to deal with different people who were involved in the Holocaust, different groups of people, different cohorts, if you like, to use a term. A very fine scholar of blessed memory, Joan Ringelheim, who passed just recently, I think it was, who wrote about much earlier in the 1970s, 1980s. She was writing about the need to consider, for example, the different experiences of women to men during the Holocaust. We're not talking about some great amorphous mass. We're talking about, well, ultimately we're talking about individual human beings, but we're talking about different types of experience from different cohorts. I use the word again, different cohorts of people, different groups of people, and their experiences. And children, of course, children being children are often last on the totem pole to be considered.
Absolutely.
Because who pays attention to kids?
Right.
And of course, there's another dimension to it, and that is that what happened to children is very frequently only related by the children when they're adults.
Right.
So you don't actually know what the kids are going through as their kids.
Yeah. And depending on the age, this was another point that was brought up by, I think, one of my students, of there comes that point where if you're a small child going through this, you have to learn what's normal because you grew up in such an abnormal time. You have to learn what the rest of the world is going to expect of you because, you know, children can bounce back, but you have to have something to bounce back to or to bounce back from.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Absolutely.
It's an interesting, you know, part of the onion that we have to uncover here, and this unpeeling and this layering that we have here.
You're never going to get to an inner core. No. Just more layers.
I always say that you could spend the rest of your life, every single day, studying a different aspect of the Holocaust, and it would outlive you. There's no way.
A very great early historian, Jacob Robinson by name, excuse me, wrote in 1966 that in the normal course of events, usual course of events, a number of things will happen that need to be rescued in the space of 1 year. But he said he concluded every day in the Holocaust was the equivalent of 1,000 years happening. So that from 1960, always stayed with me from what he wrote in 1966 when I was a very young scholar in the mid 70s, early 70s. I'm aging myself. In which that's something to think about. What you do, layers of an onion, absolutely. This is just one little facet of that.
Yeah,
every
absolutely.
day was to rescue 1,000 years of history.
Wow. It really puts it into perspective too.
And I don't think he's wrong.
No, absolutely. You've got some great comments here that your lectures are always very eye-opening. Hope you're well. Lots of well wishes. Thank you. Excellent work, excellent presentation. I don't see any further questions. Folks, if you think of anything, if you go to bed later on and you're ruminating on something, you think about something tomorrow morning, you can feel free to email me. It's sarah.gottwallace. My name is up in the chat box there a few times if you want that crazy spelling of Gottwallace. So it's sarah.gottwallace@fsw.edu. If you think of any further questions, just feel free to relay those to me. I'll get with Dr. Bartrop. We'll get an answer for you and I'll get that back to you. In the meanwhile, thank you so much for spending the time with us, Dr. Bartrop, illuminating and thought-provoking, as always.
I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful for all the kind comments. Thanks, everybody. And now, as I used to do with my students, the Zoom wave as we say goodbye.
Exactly. Before we do say goodbye, I just want to do a quick little plug. April 7th at 6 o'clock on our campus, we are going to be hosting a play called Remember, the Abe Price Story. That's going to be in our library building. That's J103. Be looking for that. That's going to be on our website, actually. There's a teaser for that on our website with further information. Mark it on your calendars, April 7th at 6 p.m., room J103 in our library. We're going to be presenting Remember, the Abe Price Story. It's going to be a very moving play. Can't wait to present that to you folks as well. Dr. Bartrop, it's always very lovely to close up our week with you. And as you say, we shall do